Hello and welcome, everybody. It's great to have you joining this part of the workshop today, where we want to explore some case studies for domain of one's own. And the reason why we included this is that, even if you're an experienced admin or maybe you're just getting started, there are so many different domain of one's own across lots of different institutions. And we wanted to give you a chance to take a look behind the scenes and see what's happening in other institutions. And hopefully along the way, find some inspiration in, some of the initiatives that we explore and also some of the tools. So Taylor, you've already met throughout the day, but Taylor, do you just want to say hi?
I'm excited to be here, and the one of the things that I really like about what we're going to talk about today is the fact that you mentioned that there's a lot of different types of domain of one's own, and that to be less than humble about Reclaim for a second. I really like that we get to support something that can take so many different forms for schools,
Mm-hmm.
because I think this is there's really no two domain of one's own at different schools that are the same. Maybe technically, or philosophically, or how they're viewed by students and faculty and staff that use it. There are a lot of they're all situated a little bit differently, and that means every admin that I've worked with talks about and supports them a little bit differently, which in turn means we support the admins all a little bit differently depending on their needs. So I really like getting to highlight that. We usually make a spot at each workshop to do that, and so that's what we're going to do here today. And
Yeah.
hopefully this can kind of get the gears turning. If there's something you're thinking about your own project that you'd like to explore, we can talk about some cool work happening elsewhere, and I always find that refreshing and sort of energizing. So
Yeah, I agree. And I'm super curious, like when we look into this ourselves, and I suppose we should tell folks as well that, obviously our team through support and providing advice and helping with setup and migrations and things, we get a lot of the ins and outs of how these projects work. But then the case studies that we do, mainly Jim and myself work on these and interview teams within institutions. They're really a much deeper dive and they go beyond the kind of technical everyday, what you just mentioned about, what do these domain of one's own grow into? How do they flourish? And what does that look like? Not like a month down the year, but down the line rather. But what happens 2 years down the line, or in the case of one of the things we're going to be looking at today, 10 years down the line. What does a domain of one's own look like a decade into the making? So, along the way, we're also going to highlight case studies that focus on tools like Omeka and Grav and Scalar. So, just to give you a bit of a technical inspiration as well, but mainly we're going to be talking about two recent case studies that we completed this year. One is with Stanford University, where we're going to be looking at a decade old domain of one's own that is going from strength to strength. And we're also going to be talking about the case study with Princeton, where again, we're going to look at kind of what the whole team that works on domain of one's own does. And they they are, I think, super interesting because the case study ended up being a lot about faculty and student support and outreach, and not as much about the technology. So hopefully you guys listening and viewing this will be interested to kind of come along on the ride with us today. So yeah, are you ready to jump in, Taylor?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the first case study I'll kick us off with is the Stanford A Decade of Domain of One's Own in the Making. And we've included the link to this one and all the other case studies featured here in the resources for the workshop. So if you want to share this with colleagues or read in your own time, you can certainly go back to that. Um, but I think the reason why we picked this one was that Stanford was one of the very first schools to adopt a domain of one's own back in 2014, 2015. So it's not been, it wasn't that much long after Reclaim was founded. And so that collaboration with Reclaim and the team at Stanford has been really long standing. It has been so interesting to kind of go behind the scenes and try to understand where that came from. And I think, Taylor, this is where like the geek in me really rejoiced because we were talking about how 10 years ago, there was a really like a file system basically that did the job that domain of one's own became in the end. That was prior to kind of having a campus-wide VLE to support staff and students. This was very much a free-for-all with very digitally literate, adventurous staff and students kind of, in the wild west of the open web, so to speak. And so Domain of One's Own became a kind of way to still give students and staff space, and have that ownership and being able to dive into the research that they wanted to do or the projects or do something weird and wonderful for a course, but then also work alongside a more structured VLE, that provides more robust and consistent support, and obviously other IT systems. So I loved where this started, this case study.
Yeah, I mean, when this one when you all were getting ready to publish it, because I hadn't been privy to many of the conversations you all had had with Stanford up to that point, and reading about that, in many ways, Larry Dillard views it as a extension of what they started in like 1994. That's amazing, and I'm positive, that also is something that Jim really latched on to, because early web stuff. We talk about this a lot in like Reclaim community spaces, but the early parts of the web were started by higher education and research and literally CERN, right? So to see something really kind of have a through line of that length is just, it's excellent. Like, and
Mm-hmm.
it's also not something I think that people probably see externally a lot but it is a common thing that we have on new domain of one's own schools, is they'll say, we're looking to do a domain of one's own program, we want to do this for these like teaching and learning reasons. Also, we have like 5 other little things that kind of don't have a home that we're just kind of like throw in that net too,
Yeah.
because we could host them on that system. That is very common, but it's not something that maybe gets talked about a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, we really love to see, because it gives some of those things a new lease on life, or a place to have a good archive that isn't, and by good I mean accessible, in the
Yeah.
same way or a similar way to it has been. It's not just here's a screenshot of what that website used to look like, right? You can see the actual thing. And it is really fascinating too, because you mentioned like the file system thing, and they're using a pretty complicated distributed file system to do a lot of this stuff in the earliest days, because in order to do what they wanted to do on Stanford scale, that's what was necessary at the time. And I'm sure that was not something they wanted to maintain for probably a whole host of technical reasons.
Yeah.
And so to see that transform into this thing that we can manage, and we're also managing with tools that are largely standard tools, right? Like that. These are we're helping folks try and find a good fit for these things, and kind of helping folks figure that out. That's work we really like to do around here. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's cool.
And I think like, it's there. I think in higher ed in particular, there is this sort of veneer of sort of elegant solutionism in a lot of tech, isn't there? When you watch these promotional videos or you kind of see the glossy website, like technology is like seamless and integrated. And, like every single institution I've ever worked in has like, yeah, okay, we have the seamless integration at top level. It all looks beautiful. But then underneath,
It's
there's the
never, yeah.
skeletons in the closet. There is the, old databases. There is the, old files. And I think that's where the longevity of a relationship between a company that's independent and a small dedicated team like Reclaim and a large institution comes to being. Because, Jim still remembers the 2014 kind of setup work. And,
Hmm.
a lot of people who the teams work with, and I think we'll come to talk about this in the next case study as well, has a lot of continuity. And
Yeah.
that is when we interviewed Larry and Martini and Akasa. We asked about, is it kind of a solution to solve a legacy problem, or is it still growing? Where is it going? And that's one of the quotes I wanted to pull out from Larry, where, you know, he was reflecting on what they see happening in the next sort of 6 to 12 months. And he said, with a growing number of users, I see that we're on a tipping edge of needing to spread load, specifically needing to spread the load to another new server. And he said, the legacy system was highly used, but then now there's also a high need to continue to grow the domain of one's own service as the university's central mission is disseminating information. And I think
Mhm.
that's something that I found really powerful, is to kind of think about the role of domain of one's own in that mission, in disseminating information from individual, you know, grad students, academics, researchers, and so on. So that I think really spoke to me, sort of, where it came from and where we're heading.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, the word, I've been distracted for over the last 15 seconds, honestly, by the word mission here.
Mm-hmm.
Because mostly so that I can try and say something that I feel very strongly in words that make any sense, which is that a common thing we do see across domain of one's own programs is that ones that last a long time and are successful and people find value in are tied to mission.
Mm-hmm.
And that is about as important a thing you can bring to the table, because we're, at Reclaim, we're going to help with the technical side of things. Of course, that's what you're paying for. um, and we're going to try and give the best advice we can, but things like this really need to have a place they live in a institution that matter, that where they
Mm-hmm.
matter. It can't just be, here is a technical system that we can provide, because the reality is, having folks learn these tools like cPanel, WordPress, and
Mm-hmm.
applications you can run in there. It's complicated. And if your mission for Domain of One's Own is to have folks be able to have a space to learn and play with the web, then they're going to need some support there. But if conversely, if your mission is more related to, preserving things that are created,
Mm-hmm.
which is equally valid, that requires a different type of focus and attention. And again, I'm not talking technical, right? I'm talking in how you position and talk about this service with folks, and why you have it and why it matters and why it's a good tool to use versus, you know, the myriad of other tools you have access to. So the you know, the university's central mission is disseminating information. Yeah, I can see how the domain of one's own can play a big role in that, or at least a really impactful role. But it's a
Mm-hmm.
good, important thing to think about, whether you're new to domain of one's own or thinking about thinking about it, or if you're in your second decade. So.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess I know we're going to move on to the next case study in a minute, but I just wanted to say I think for me, in a domain of one's own workshop context, we don't have as much time to talk about the wider ecosystem of sort of the fragmentation of the web, the fragmentation of social networks, which is a piece that I know many of us at Reclaim are really interested in, and we've done work on with kind of federated networks and federated spaces. But I think that is where, this work to kind of see the domain of one's own initiative over a decade and into the future, I kind of imagine how much stability that provides at a very uncertain time, in education, in higher ed history. We're at a time of great risks and uncertainties. So I kind of see that was like you. I think that came close to my heart. I was like, yes, there is some continuity there as well. All right. What do you say? Like, I feel we could talk more about this, but let's move on, folks. Let's go to our second case study. So
Mhm.
this one was a little bit different, but no less interesting. We had a wonderful team, and Taylor, if you just scroll down to the bottom of this for a second, folk will be able to see the team who we interviewed for this case study. So this is Jay and his colleagues, and it was so much fun talking to them. Um, they had a lot to say about their domain of one's own at Princeton, and we're going to kind of dive into this in just a moment. But really, just to give you a kind of flavor, so what we were talking about here is to really look at what it takes to make it work at scale when you basically herding cats, and when you're trying to get all academics to do things on an annual basis that are regularly required. So, what are your thoughts on that, Taylor?
Yeah, that is anyone working in any type of support role in an institution that will not be surprising to them. It's difficult work to get really any group of people on the same page about anything, especially when it's technical. Especially when your job is to support something technical and help guide people through a complex process. It's very difficult to do that. You do need to provide an air of that seamlessness you were talking about before, of like, yes, this is the plan and it's going to be easy and we're going to work it out. But we all know that, like, on the back end, there's, on the technical side, there's a lot of work to make that happen. A lot of testing, a lot of building of tools and systems and infrastructure. And so this is a story about that in a lot of ways. And I think, I think a success story, I should say, I should qualify with. So, this is a really great one to highlight too, I think.
Yeah, and like to give you an example of what we talked about. So, one of the things that we focused on with the team is kind of how to keep domain of one's own up to date, how to audit your server and kind of get rid of sites that are no longer needed, how to make sure, the two things that are on everybody's mind right now. First one, security, and I know we'll be talking about this quite a lot in the workshop today, and also accessibility, and how do we make sure that auditing processes, robust processes, are taking place. And one of the things that Jason and his team were explaining really, really eloquently is the amount of human effort that goes into reaching out to individuals, via email, going, to courses on campus, and having all these different processes in place internally to be able to then make sure that the technology and the domain server is actually kept up to date and is kind of safe and sound and robust and a happy place. So yeah, I don't know, what do you have much experience of working with schools on processes like that? Because their process sounded amazing. They had comms, they had tracking, they had spreadsheets, they had servers, services. Like, it was really impressive.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because I think almost everyone who will who's at this workshop will probably have had, there's going to be some exceptions, but will have had a server migration in the last year or two, because we've been replacing a lot of our fleet of servers with new ones. And the interesting thing about Princeton in particular is, while they are using domain of one's own, it is situated, the mission of it, I would say, is different than a lot of the schools we support. They use it for a few different things, but there's a lot of what they would describe, and I think in literally uh, in this wow, I'm losing the word case study. Okay, the phrase case study. In this case study, described as high impact sites. So sites that really can't have much downtime to speak of. And on top of that, due to some technical things that aren't super interesting, there are less actions we can take on the reclaim side to ensure that happens, basically. Normally, when we do a server migration, we do pretty much everything for the folks, and we have a few things that we need them to do, and it's pretty seamless. There were some extra factors here that made it more complicated, and they identified that they needed to take a very hands-on approach to a large number of the sites on their platform. So yeah, it was really interesting to see that. Whereas, in I guess folks won't necessarily know, but we do other types of server migrations. We will sometimes do 2-3 a week. Like we're pretty good at them. This was a very unique one, and I think worth documenting because of the process they sort of developed and sort of their philosophy of how they were going to support it and what we were able to bring to that as well. So.
Yeah, and just to give folk a sense of timescale, like we're talking about over 12 months. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
a very long project. And, they had a huge number of sites across 3 servers, which they were thinking of as personal development and production. And they also wanted to streamline about, 30% of their accounts and sites. So I have pulled out a quote for us again, just so that I want to make sure we sort of share the voices of the people who so kindly make time to talk to us. And so from the Office of Information Technology, which is where the main team was based, and collaborating with the campus partners and obviously, our own team. So Jason, who was setting out the scope of the project, explained it like this. He said, the domain of one's own service is being used widely by faculty and departmental staff across 3 servers, which I just mentioned, personal development and production. And the migration was essential in order to shore up the security and improve accessibility. And for them, the migration process offered the opportunity to take stock as a team and to start that conversation. That is the important piece, really, with campus partners to take stock and then to do the streamlining of about 30% of accounts and sites, both in respect of quantity and quality. And that was such an interesting conversation to have about the giant image files that they
Mm-hmm.
found along the way, or all these sorts of anachronistic pieces that made sense at the time, but then in the long term you kind of lose track of. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting too. I really like my favorite one of my favorite parts of this is the putting people at the heart of change management heading, which is an interesting mix of, I think, good like customer service or good people centered service management, we'll call it. Wow, that I don't know. I don't know if I invented that jargon, but that was pretty jargony way to say really putting people first is what I mean. And I love that their approach here. They were really focused on the communication, and I do think that is like the first and last stop on any successful service management update migration, anything like this where there's going to be an impact for people using it. The success of it really lives and dies on the quality of the communication, in my opinion. You can get folks on board with maintenance that needs to happen, say this is not going to be available for these days, but truly giving people a sense of what will happen, what they should expect, what is expected of them, is it really sounds easy, right? Like it really sounds like that should be easy to do and say, yeah, just send them an email and tell them we're going to migrate the server on this day and then it'll be down. But like, or in this case, not really down actually, but they may have action required. We would like them to log in after the migration to make sure things are working as they expect. Um, that is consistently more difficult to do than it is to say, in my opinion. And so I really like that they were so focused on that aspect here.
Yeah, and I know that, before we wrap up and highlight any other resources to folks on the workshop page, because we have more case studies and examples of text tools and tech that you could use than we have time for to cover in this session. But I did want to kind of say, I think that's where for me the kind of knowledge piece and the sharing, the peer sharing kind of workshops like this and our other community events really come in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I really enjoy the case studies, because I think everybody kind of reinvents the wheel when it comes to how to manage these processes. Like
Yeah.
everybody kind of reinvents their own little system. And sure, to some degree, you do need to customize. But I think given that, we now have schools who have had domain of one's own for over 10 years, we have schools who are doing it, for a whole year and who are willing to kind of share their lessons learned. I think I'm hoping what folks listening and viewing this will take away from is the idea that if you do have a large migration project coming up, or if you are looking for something that will stand the test of time, there are now examples of successful kind of strategies and where to invest it. And the lessons learned in those case studies kind of at the bottom of each piece hopefully will give that kind of at least a starting point. And now our community of practice that we have on Discord will hopefully give folk channels to kind of post questions in and reach out to each other, because that's kind of what we're here to do, isn't it? Like to kind of help signpost all of that.
Yeah.
So I know we only have a few minutes left. So do you want to give a quick shout out to some of the other links that we've included on the case study page? Just so that folk who might want to look at that afterwards know what to what to expect.
Yeah, absolutely. So on this topic page, we've of course got linked the Stanford and Princeton case studies we were just talking about. We also have a few knowledge base articles here that we wanted to highlight. We've got a couple that I think are worth checking out. So we have a knowledge base article just pointing to some Omeka installations that we think are particularly interesting examples. If you're someone who doesn't really understand where Omeka might fit in your project, this is a good thing to check out and see kind of what people are creating with Omeka. We have basically a general article about Grav, but it also includes sort of some case studies and some use cases in it, links to and references to other interesting Grav sites. Kind of a similar thing. If you're not sure what Grav is good for, this I would check this out, and this is kind of the why of a system, a CMS like that. And finally, another one kind of like Scalar. So kind of like the other two, but about Scalar. So in this, we have a couple links to other Scalar sites. I think this trio of sort of application focused case studies are really interesting if you're looking to kind of break out of the tools you already know well, and you want to see what else can be done. I would definitely check that out. I would also just shout out to the fact that we're always publishing these. They did these bigger case studies take a while for us to work through, but you can check them out blog.reclaimhosting.com. If you aren't already, you can subscribe, get email notifications when we post new things here. Or you can, use your RSS reader to subscribe there. But these are where the case studies get published. So I would recommend you stay tuned here.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor. And thanks for letting me join this session of the workshop. I love doing these case studies. I find them so interesting. And I happen to know that there's a new one in the works. So hopefully in the next month or two after the workshop, there'll be even more community goodness to share with you. So thanks very much for having me.
Excellent. And we'll see everybody in the next session. Thanks.
See you, everybody. Thanks for listening.